My husband threw tantrums for months, slammed a sauce jar so hard it cracked, flipped the coffee table, and his mom said, "Boys will be boys." So I threw bigger ones back. I married Nathan after dating for 2 years, and everything was great until we moved in together. We had this nice little duplex with a big kitchen and a backyard where I grew tomatoes and peppers. Nathan worked from home doing consulting, and I worked at the veterinary clinic downtown. We split everything down the middle and took turns cooking dinner. Life was good until about 3 months after the wedding when I saw who Nathan really was. We were at the grocery store and I grabbed the wrong brand of pasta sauce. Nathan grabbed the jar from my hand and slammed it back on the shelf so hard it cracked. The store employee just stared at us. Nathan said the sauce had too much sugar and walked off like nothing happened. I bought the sauce anyway because we needed it for dinner. When we got home, Nathan saw the jar in the bag and threw it in the trash. Then he made himself a sandwich and went to his office. After that, the tantrums started happening all the time. If I bought the wrong coffee creamer, he'd pour the whole bottle down the sink while I was watching. If I forgot to record his show, he'd unplug the TV and carry it to the garage. If dinner wasn't ready when he wanted it, he'd take every pot and pan out of the cabinet and stack them on the counter. The worst was when I came home late from an emergency surgery at the clinic. Nathan had thrown every single pillow and blanket from our bed into the bathtub and turned on the shower. He said if I couldn't be home on time, I didn't deserve a comfortable bed. I slept on the couch that night while he sprawled across our king-size mattress. My friend Lisa kept telling me to leave, but I wanted to handle this myself first. Nathan had this whole routine where he'd throw his fit, storm off to his office, then come back an hour later acting like nothing happened. He'd ask what was for dinner or if I wanted to watch a movie. If I brought up what he did, he'd say I was being sensitive and making a big deal over nothing. One time I tried to talk to him about it calmly, and he threw his coffee mug at the wall. Not near me, but close enough that I jumped. Then he said I was being dramatic about a little noise. His mom came to visit, and I tried to tell her what was happening. She watched Nathan flip the coffee table because I forgot to buy his protein bars, and she said boys will be boys. She actually said that. Then she told me her husband used to break plates when he was stressed, and it was my job to keep Nathan happy. That's when I realized nobody was going to fix this but me. So I started matching his energy. When Nathan threw the remote at the wall because the game was buffering, I picked up his gaming headset and launched it out the back door into the garden. He ran outside and spent an hour looking for it in the dark. When he poured out my expensive shampoo because I took too long in the shower, I took his entire shelf of supplements and protein powder and dumped them in the kitchen trash. He had to dig through coffee grounds and old food to get them back. When he knocked all my makeup off the bathroom counter because I left a hair in the sink, I went to his office and swept everything off his desk onto the floor. His laptop survived, but his coffee went everywhere. Nathan started getting confused. He'd throw his tantrum and wait for me to clean up or apologize, but instead I'd throw a bigger one. He threw a book at the door. I threw 3. He slammed cabinets. I slammed them harder. He started yelling that I was crazy and out of control. I yelled back that I was just expressing my feelings as he did. The breaking point came when Nathan's boss called him for an important video meeting. Nathan was in his office, and I was in the kitchen making lunch. I accidentally dropped a pan, and Nathan came storming out screaming about the noise. So I grabbed every pan we owned and started dropping them one by one. Nathan's face turned this deep red color that started at his neck and spread up to his hairline. His laptop screen showed his boss Winston's face frozen mid-question, and I could hear the tinny voice coming through the speakers asking what all that noise was about. Nathan slammed the laptop shut so hard I thought the screen might crack. He started walking toward me with his hands balled up into fists at his sides, and for a second I thought about backing up or apologizing or doing something to defuse the situation like I always did. But I was still holding that big cast iron skillet in my hand, and something in me just refused to move. Nathan stopped about 3 feet away from me, and we just stared at each other while he breathed really hard through his nose. I could see something different in his eyes that I'd never seen before. Something that looked almost like fear. Like he suddenly realized I wasn't going to back down this time. He opened his mouth like he was going to yell at me, but nothing came out. Then he spun around and punched the hallway wall so hard his fist went straight through the drywall. The sound was this awful crunch, and then he was shaking his hand and cursing, and he walked straight to his office and slammed the door so hard the whole duplex shook. I heard the lock click from where I was standing in the kitchen. I put the pan down on the counter and my hands were shaking. All the other pans were scattered across the kitchen floor like some kind of crazy obstacle course. I started picking them up one by one and putting them back in the cabinet, and my heart was beating so fast I could feel it in my throat. Through the office door, I could hear Nathan talking on his phone, and his voice had this high, panicked edge to it that I'd never heard before. I walked closer to the door and pressed my ear against it. He was telling someone that I'd lost my mind, that I'd ruined his important work call on purpose, that he didn't know what to do with me anymore. I realized he was talking to his mother. He kept saying things like, "She's out of control, and I can't live like this, and you need to come over here and talk to her." I stepped back from the door and went to sit on the couch in the living room. My phone was on the coffee table, and I opened it up to my photos. I'd been taking pictures of everything Nathan destroyed over the past few months without really thinking about why. There was the cracked sauce jar from the grocery store, the soaked bedding in the bathtub, my makeup scattered all over the bathroom floor, the dent in the wall from where he threw his coffee mug, the broken TV remote, my shampoo bottle empty in the sink. I had dozens of photos documenting every single one of his tantrums. Less than an hour later, I heard a key turning in our front door. Nathan must have given his mother a key without asking me because Lorraine just walked right in like she owned the place. She didn't even knock. She came into the living room where I was still sitting on the couch and stood there with her hands on her hips looking at me like I was a misbehaving child. She started in on this lecture about how a wife needs to respect her husband's work time and create a peaceful home environment and be supportive instead of destructive. She said Nathan had important responsibilities and I needed to understand that my behavior was affecting his career. I just sat there listening to her go on, and then I held up my phone. I started showing her the photos one by one without saying anything. The cracked sauce jar, the soaked bedding, my makeup everywhere, the wall damage, the empty bottles. She went quiet as she looked at each photo and her face got this pinched expression like she'd bitten into something sour. When I got to the last photo, she handed my phone back to me and said we both needed to grow up. Not just Nathan. Both of us. Like I was equally responsible for this mess we were living in. Nathan's office door opened and he came out looking all disheveled with his hair sticking up. He and Lorraine went into the kitchen and started having this quiet conversation, but the duplex is small enough that I could hear most of it from the living room. Lorraine told him he needed to handle his wife, and those exact words made my stomach turn. Nathan complained that I'd changed, that I used to be sweet and easy to get along with, that now I was impossible to live with. He didn't mention any of his own behavior, or the fact that he'd been throwing tantrums for months before I started fighting back. Lorraine said something about marriage being hard work, and both people needing to compromise, but then she told Nathan that men sometimes need to be firm with their wives. I wanted to get up and throw something at both of them, but I just sat there on the couch gripping the armrest so hard my knuckles turned white. After Lorraine finally left, Nathan came and sat on the opposite end of the couch from me. We sat there in complete silence for what felt like forever. I looked at the clock on the wall and watched the minutes tick by. 1 hour passed, then another. Neither of us said a single word because what was there even to say at this point? We'd crossed into some kind of territory where normal couple communication didn't work anymore. We couldn't just talk about our feelings or work through our problems like regular people because we'd been destroying each other's stuff and yelling and throwing things for months. The silence was so heavy, it felt like something physical sitting between us on the couch. Nathan kept clearing his throat like he was going to say something, but then he'd just shift his position and stay quiet. I stared at the wall where he'd punched the hole and thought about how we were going to have to fix that before the landlord saw it. I thought about how much money we'd wasted on replacing things we'd broken. I thought about how tired I was of living like this. That night, Nathan took a pillow and blanket from the closet and went to sleep in his office. I went to our bedroom and lay down on the bed, but I couldn't fall asleep. I kept staring at the ceiling thinking about everything that had happened. I'd matched Nathan's energy like I thought I was supposed to, like I was standing up for myself and refusing to be pushed around. But lying there in the dark, I realized that matching his tantrums hadn't fixed anything at all. I'd just proved that I could be as destructive as him. We were both living in a war zone that we'd created together. The duplex that used to feel like home now felt like a battlefield. My tomatoes and peppers in the backyard were probably dying because I hadn't had the energy to take care of them in weeks. Everything we'd built together was falling apart, and I didn't know how to stop it. I'd thought that fighting back would make Nathan see how awful his behavior was, but instead it just gave him an excuse to say I was crazy too. I finally fell asleep around 3 in the morning feeling more exhausted than I'd ever felt in my life. The next morning I woke up to the smell of coffee. I walked into the kitchen and found Nathan standing by the coffee maker with this big fake smile on his face. He asked me what I wanted for breakfast in this cheerful voice that sounded completely wrong after everything that had happened yesterday. I just stood there staring at him trying to figure out if he was serious. I told him we needed to talk about what was happening to us, about the fighting and the destruction, and his mother walking into our house uninvited. Nathan's fake smile got even bigger, and he said there was nothing to talk about if I would just stop overreacting to everything. He said we could go back to normal if I would calm down and stop making problems where there weren't any. I felt something break inside me when he said that. Not in a dramatic way, just this quiet realization that Nathan genuinely believed none of this was his fault. He thought I was the problem. He thought if I would just go back to being quiet and accepting his tantrums, everything would be fine. I didn't say anything else to him. I just went back to the bedroom and got ready for work. I drove to the veterinary clinic downtown and walked in through the back entrance like I always did. My coworker Alyssa was in the break room making coffee, and she took one look at my face and asked if everything was okay at home. I opened my mouth to give her my usual response about how everything was fine, but instead I felt my eyes fill up with tears. Alyssa put down her coffee mug and took my arm and led me into the supply room. She closed the door behind us and I just started crying. Not pretty crying either, but the kind where you can't breathe right and your nose runs everywhere. I told her everything. About the pasta sauce at the grocery store, and Nathan throwing things and pouring out my shampoo and soaking our bedding in the bathtub. I told her about how I'd started fighting back and throwing bigger tantrums than his. I told her about the pans yesterday, and Nathan punching the wall and his mother showing up uninvited. Alyssa listened to the whole thing without interrupting once. When I finally stopped talking and wiped my face with a paper towel, Alyssa was quiet for a minute. Then she said very gently that what I was describing sounded like an abusive relationship. I started to argue with her because Nathan had never actually hit me, but she held up her hand. She said abuse wasn't just physical, and that destroying property and controlling behavior and creating a scary environment all counted. She said even though I was fighting back now, that didn't make it better. She said 2 people destroying each other wasn't a relationship. It was mutual destruction. She asked me if this was really how I wanted to live for the rest of my life. I stood there in the supply room surrounded by boxes of medical supplies and bags of dog food, and I realized I didn't have an answer to that question. I spent the rest of my shift at the clinic going through the motions of my job, while my brain kept replaying what Alyssa said about mutual destruction. I checked a beagle's ears for mites and thought about Nathan punching the wall. I gave a cat her vaccines and thought about me throwing pans during his work call. I cleaned exam rooms and thought about how we'd both become people I didn't recognize anymore. When I finally drove home that evening, I sat in the driveway for 10 minutes staring at our duplex. The lights were on in the kitchen and I could see Nathan moving around inside. Part of me wanted to just keep driving and never come back. But I got out of the car and walked to the front door because running away wouldn't fix anything either. I opened the door and stopped dead in the entryway. The kitchen table was set with our nice plates and cloth napkins we only used for company. Candles were burning in the middle of the table. Takeout containers from my favorite Thai restaurant were arranged on the counter, and the smell of pad Thai and green curry filled the whole house. Nathan came out of the kitchen wearing a smile that looked completely fake after everything that had happened. He asked if I was hungry and gestured at the table like he'd done something amazing. I just stood there holding my purse and staring at this scene he'd created. It was so obvious what he was doing. His mom probably taught him this exact move when he was growing up watching his dad break plates and then buy flowers the next day. Make a big romantic gesture and pretend the bad stuff never happened. Smooth everything over with fancy food and candles instead of actually talking about the real problems. I walked past him to the bedroom and changed out of my scrubs while Nathan stayed in the kitchen. When I came back out, he was sitting at the table waiting for me with that same fake smile plastered on his face. I sat down across from him and he immediately started dishing pad Thai onto my plate. I watched him serve the food and arrange everything just right, and I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no hope, no sadness. Just this empty feeling like I was watching a stranger perform a play I'd seen too many times before. I put my fork down before even taking a bite and told Nathan we needed couples therapy. I said our marriage was falling apart and we needed professional help to fix it. Nathan actually laughed. Not a mean laugh exactly, but this dismissive sound like I'd said something ridiculous. He said therapy was for people with real problems like addiction or affairs. He said we just needed to stop being so dramatic about everything and get back to normal. I asked him what normal meant to him, and he said it meant me not overreacting when he got frustrated and him not having to walk on eggshells in his own home. I pointed out that he'd punched a hole in our wall yesterday. And that wasn't frustration. That was violence. Nathan rolled his eyes and said I was making it sound worse than it was. He said lots of guys punch walls when they're mad and it didn't mean anything. I sat there looking at him across the candlelit table with expensive takeout getting cold between us, and I realized he genuinely believed what he was saying. He actually thought punching walls and destroying my stuff and soaking our bedding in the tub was normal behavior that I should just accept. The romantic dinner wasn't an apology. It was a bribe to get me to go back to being quiet and manageable. I stood up from the table and told Nathan I was serious about therapy. He said he wasn't going to waste money on some therapist who would just take my side anyway. I went to the bedroom and closed the door while Nathan stayed at the table eating Thai food by himself. The next morning, I woke up to Nathan's voice coming through the bedroom wall. He was in his office talking loud enough that I could hear every word. I got up and pressed my ear against the wall between our bedroom and his office. Nathan was on the phone with his boss, and his voice had this fake, cheerful tone that made my skin crawl. I heard him say something about construction next door causing noise issues yesterday. He apologized for the disruption to the video meeting and promised it wouldn't happen again. There was a long pause where Nathan wasn't talking, and I figured his boss was responding. Then Nathan's voice got higher and more stressed. He said the construction was unexpected and he'd already filed a complaint with the building management. Another pause. Nathan said he understood the client had been on the call, and he took full responsibility for not warning everyone about potential noise. His voice was getting tighter, and I could tell his boss wasn't buying the construction story. Nathan spent the next hour on damage control calls. I got dressed and ready for work while listening to him talk to different people trying to fix his professional reputation. He called someone named Winston back and spent 20 minutes explaining his home office situation and promising his work quality wouldn't suffer. He called another colleague and asked them to smooth things over with a client who'd been on the disrupted call. Every conversation made him sound more desperate, and I realized his job might actually be in trouble because of what I'd done with the pans. Part of me felt guilty, but a bigger part of me thought about all the times Nathan had made me late for work or disrupted my life with his tantrums, and he never cared about the consequences for me. I was making coffee in the kitchen when someone knocked on our front door. I opened it and found our landlord standing there looking annoyed. He said he'd gotten noise complaints from both neighbors about crashing sounds and yelling coming from our duplex. He asked if he could come in and look around. I let him in because I didn't know what else to do. The landlord walked through our living room and immediately saw the hole Nathan had punched in the hallway wall. He stopped and stared at it for a long time. Then he kept walking and noticed the cabinet door in the kitchen hanging crooked where the hinge had broken during one of our fights. He opened the cabinet and the door came completely off in his hand. The landlord set the broken cabinet door on the counter and turned to look at me. He asked very directly if he needed to be concerned about his property. I opened my mouth but no words came out. Nathan came out of his office right then, and the landlord's whole face changed. He asked Nathan what was going on with all the damage and noise complaints. Nathan immediately switched into this charming, friendly mode that made me want to throw up. He smiled at the landlord and said everything was fine. He said we'd had some minor accidents, but he was planning to repair everything himself this weekend. He put his hand on my shoulder like we were this happy couple, and I had to force myself not to pull away. The landlord looked at Nathan's hand on my shoulder and then looked at my face. He asked me directly if I felt safe in this house. I froze. Nathan's hand tightened on my shoulder. The landlord kept looking at me waiting for an answer, and I couldn't figure out what to say. If I said no, what would happen? Would the landlord call the police? Would Nathan get even angrier? If I said yes, was I lying? Did I actually feel safe here anymore? I finally said I was fine in this quiet voice that didn't sound convincing even to me. The landlord didn't look like he believed me, but he couldn't force me to say anything else. Nathan walked the landlord to the door, still being all friendly and charming. He promised again to fix everything and keep the noise down. The landlord handed Nathan a written warning about the noise complaints and property damage. He said any more problems, and he'd start eviction proceedings. Nathan took the paper and kept smiling until the landlord left. The second the door closed, Nathan's fake smile disappeared. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. He turned to me and started yelling about how I'd embarrassed him and made us look like trashy people who couldn't handle our problems. He said the landlord probably thought he was some kind of abuser now because of how I acted. I pointed out that he literally punched a wall yesterday, and the landlord could see the evidence. Nathan said that was different because I'd provoked him by dropping the pans during his meeting. He said if I hadn't started that whole thing, none of this would have happened. I told him he'd been throwing tantrums and breaking stuff for months before I ever fought back. Nathan said I was twisting everything around and making him sound like a bad guy when he was just reacting to my behavior. We stood in the hallway yelling at each other until I couldn't take it anymore and went to the guest room and slammed the door. That night, I got ready for bed in the guest room. I'd brought my pillow and some blankets in there earlier. I was just getting under the covers when I heard Nathan in the hallway. The guest room door opened and Nathan walked in. He didn't say anything, just went straight to the bed and started pulling the mattress off the frame. I asked him what he was doing and he said if I wanted to sleep separately, then I could sleep on the floor or the couch. He dragged the mattress out of the guest room and down the hall to his office. I heard him shoving furniture around to make room for it. I stood in the empty guest room looking at the bare bed frame and felt something break inside me that hadn't broken before. This wasn't anger or destruction during a fight. This was cold, calculated punishment because I'd tried to set a boundary. I grabbed my pillow and went to the living room couch. I lay there in the dark, listening to Nathan moving around in his office and thought about how we'd gotten to this point. I thought about the grocery store and the pasta sauce, and how that first tantrum should have been a warning sign. I thought about all the times I'd made excuses for him, or tried to fix things myself instead of leaving. I thought about how I'd started matching his tantrums, thinking it would make him see how awful his behavior was. But instead, it just gave him ammunition to say I was crazy too. The next day at work, my friend Ellie found me in the break room. She'd heard from Alyssa that things were bad at home. Ellie asked if I wanted to come stay at her place for a few days. She had a spare room and said I could have some space to think about what I wanted to do. I sat there with my coffee getting cold in my hands and seriously considered taking her up on it. It would be so easy to just pack a bag and leave for a while. But then I thought about Nathan staying in our duplex acting like he'd won something. I thought about how I'd be the one adjusting and accommodating again while he got to keep his space and his routine. I told Ellie thanks, but I wasn't leaving my own home. Nathan was the one with the problem, and I was tired of being the one who had to leave or change or fix things. Ellie looked worried, but she said she understood. She made me promise to call her anytime, day or night, if I needed help. I promised and went back to work, but I kept thinking about her offer all day. Part of me wondered if I was being stupid by staying. But another part of me was just so tired of running away from problems or trying to make myself smaller, so other people could be comfortable. When I got home that evening, Nathan's office door was closed and locked. I could hear him typing and talking on the phone. I made myself dinner and ate alone at the kitchen table. Nathan stayed in his office until after I went to bed on the couch. The next few days followed the same pattern. Nathan worked long hours with his door locked, and I went to work and came home and we barely saw each other. When we did pass in the hallway, we didn't speak. We were living like hostile roommates who happened to be married. I'd wake up on the couch and hear Nathan already in his office. I'd come home and he'd be in there with the door locked. We stopped cooking meals together. We stopped talking about our days. We stopped existing in the same space except for these brief, awkward moments in the hallway where we'd both look away and keep walking. I realized Nathan was avoiding me as much as I was avoiding him. Neither of us knew how to fix what we'd broken, and neither of us wanted to be the first one to try. So we just lived in this Cold War silence that felt worse than the yelling and destruction had been. I worked a late emergency surgery on a cat who'd eaten something toxic. By the time I finished, it was almost midnight. I drove home exhausted and just wanting to collapse on the couch. I unlocked the front door and walked into the dark house. I flipped on the kitchen light and noticed something different right away. There was a new lock on Nathan's office door. Not just the regular door lock, but one of those deadbolts you need a key for. I walked over and tried the handle, and it didn't budge. Then I went to make myself something to eat and found another new lock on the pantry door. I stood there staring at the lock on the pantry where we kept all our food. Nathan came out of his office and I asked him what he was doing. He said since I couldn't be trusted not to disturb his work, he was protecting his space and his food. I asked him if he was seriously locking up our food, and he said it was his food since he'd bought most of it. He said I could buy my own groceries and keep them somewhere else. Then he went back in his office and locked the new deadbolt behind him. I stood in the kitchen staring at the locked pantry door for a long time after Nathan went back to his office. My stomach growled because I'd worked through lunch at the clinic and now I couldn't even get to my own food. I walked to the garage and grabbed my toolbox from the shelf. Then I went straight to Nathan's office door and unscrewed the router from the wall jack. I unplugged the modem too and wrapped all the cords around both devices. Nathan's door stayed locked while I carried everything out to my car. I popped the trunk and put the router and modem inside, then locked it and took my keys with me back into the house. About 20 minutes later, Nathan came storming out of his office yelling about the internet being down. I was sitting on the couch scrolling through my phone and I told him the internet was fine, just in a safe place. He demanded to know where it was, and I said he could have it back when he unlocked the pantry. Nathan's face went red and he started pacing back and forth in the living room. He pulled out his phone and I watched him turn on his hotspot and connect his laptop to it. He gave me this smug look like he'd won something and went back to his office. I ordered pizza on my phone since I still couldn't get to any real food. The next morning, Nathan was already in his office when I left for work. I could hear him on a video call talking to someone about quarterly projections. That evening when I got home, he was still in there, but I noticed he kept coming out to check his phone. He'd look at the screen, mutter something, then go back to his office. This happened 3 more times before dinner. Finally, around 8 o'clock, he knocked on the living room wall to get my attention. I looked up from my phone and he asked where the router was. I reminded him about the pantry lock and he said that was different because the food was his. I said the internet was mine then since I paid half the bill. He went back to his office and slammed the door. The next day, I came home to find a package on the porch. Nathan must have been watching for it because he grabbed it before I even got my keys out. He took it straight to his office and I heard him ripping open the box. An hour later, I tried to connect to our Wi-Fi network and it was gone. Instead, there was a new network called Nathan's Network and it was password protected. I tried a few obvious passwords, but none of them worked. At work the next day, I was sitting in the break room watching videos on my phone during lunch. Alyssa came in to make coffee and noticed I was using my data instead of the clinic Wi-Fi. She asked why, and I told her about the separate internet networks at home. Alyssa stopped pouring her coffee and just stared at me. She set the pot down very carefully and sat across from me at the table. She said very quietly that what I was describing wasn't normal. She said I was a smart and capable person who didn't have to live like this. I told her I knew it wasn't normal, but I wasn't going to let Nathan push me around anymore. Alyssa reached across the table and put her hand on mine. She said matching his crazy didn't make me strong. It just made me participate in something that was destroying me. I pulled my hand back and said I had to get back to work. I avoided Alyssa for the rest of the day because I didn't want to hear what she was saying even though I knew she was right. Nathan started missing deadlines at work. I could hear him on stressed phone calls with his boss through his office door. One afternoon, he was in there for over an hour and I heard him saying he'd have everything done by end of day. That evening, his office door flew open and Nathan came out looking furious. He said Winston had called him in for a serious talk about his performance. He said his boss was threatening to put him on a performance improvement plan. Nathan stood in the hallway and yelled that this was all my fault for being difficult and making his home life so stressful he couldn't focus on work. I was sitting on the couch and I said nobody forced him to spend all his energy on revenge tactics instead of his actual job. Nathan grabbed his briefcase from beside the door and threw it across the room. It hit the wall right next to the hole he'd punched before and made a new dent in the drywall. The briefcase fell to the floor and papers scattered everywhere. There was a knock on the door 10 minutes later. Nathan and I both froze and looked at each other. I got up and opened it to find our landlord standing there with a clipboard. He did not look happy. He said the neighbors on both sides had reported another loud crash and he was done with warnings. He handed me a formal written notice on official letterhead. The notice said any more property damage or disturbances would result in eviction proceedings. He asked both of us to sign it to acknowledge we'd received it. Nathan came to the door and we both signed our names on the form. The landlord took it back and said he'd owned this duplex for 15 years without any problems until we moved in. He looked at both of us and said whatever we were doing to each other needed to stop or we needed to leave. Then he walked back to his car and drove away. Nathan went back to his office without saying anything. I sat on the couch and looked at the 2 holes in the wall and the scattered papers on the floor. I thought about the locked pantry and the separate internet networks, and the way we couldn't even be in the same room anymore. I grabbed my keys and went out to my car. I sat in the driveway with the engine off just staring at the duplex. An hour went by and I still couldn't make myself go back inside. The house had become this place where everything felt like a battle and I was tired all the time. I wasn't afraid Nathan would hit me because he never had. But the whole environment had turned toxic and every day felt like walking through a war zone. I pulled out my phone and just sat there holding it, not sure who to call or what to say. I ended up calling Ellie around 9 that night, still sitting in my car with the engine off. She picked up on the second ring and I could hear her TV playing in the background. I told her everything about the landlord's notice and the separate internet networks, and how Nathan and I were basically living like enemies in the same house. Ellie listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said I could come stay at her place whenever I needed to, that her couch was always available. Then she got quiet for a second before saying, maybe it was time to talk to a lawyer just to understand my options. I thanked her and hung up, then sat there staring at my phone for another 20 minutes before going inside. The next morning, I looked up divorce attorneys during my lunch break at the clinic. I told myself I was just gathering information, not actually planning to leave. I found someone named Patricia Chen who had good reviews and availability that week. I made the appointment for Thursday afternoon and didn't tell Nathan about it. When Thursday came, I left work early and drove to her office in a building downtown. The waiting room had uncomfortable chairs and magazines from 6 months ago. Patricia called me back after 10 minutes and we sat in her office with a big window overlooking the parking lot. She asked about my marriage and I gave her the basic facts about Nathan's tantrums and my retaliation. She took notes on a yellow legal pad and asked if Nathan had ever physically hurt me. I said no, he'd never hit me or anything like that. Then she asked about emotional abuse and I froze because I didn't know how to answer that question. Patricia put down her pen and explained that destroying property and controlling behavior and creating a hostile environment all counted as forms of abuse even without physical violence. She said what I was describing fit a pattern she'd seen many times before. She pulled out some pamphlets about domestic abuse and support resources, then told me to think carefully about whether I wanted to try to save this marriage or protect myself by leaving. I took the pamphlets and stuffed them in my purse, then drove home in a daze thinking about the word abuse and whether it really applied to my situation. I walked into the duplex to find a strange man working in our kitchen. He was on a ladder patching the hole Nathan had punched in the wall, and there were tools spread out on the counter. Nathan came out of his office when he heard me come in and explained that he'd hired a handyman to fix all the damage before the landlord came back. The handyman glanced between us and kept working, but I could tell he felt uncomfortable. He probably sensed the tension radiating off both of us. I went to the bedroom without saying anything to Nathan and closed the door. Later that evening, after the handyman left, Nathan found me in the kitchen making dinner. He told me in this cold, formal voice that he was fixing everything so we wouldn't get evicted, speaking to me like I was a business partner instead of his wife. I realized we hadn't had a real conversation in over a week, just these tactical exchanges about practical matters. He asked what time I'd be home tomorrow, and I told him my usual time. Then he nodded and went back to his office. I ate dinner alone at the table, looking at the freshly patched wall. At work the next day, Alyssa cornered me in the supply room and asked how things were going at home. I tried to brush her off, but she wouldn't let it go. She said I looked exhausted and stressed and she was worried about me. I finally admitted that Nathan and I were barely speaking and living like hostile roommates. Alyssa said even if Nathan wouldn't go to couples counseling, I needed to talk to someone because this situation was clearly taking a toll. She pulled up a therapist's website on her phone and showed me the profile for someone named Heidi Molina, who worked with relationship issues and trauma. I took a picture of the screen and promised Alyssa I'd think about it. I called Heidi's office that afternoon and made an appointment for the following Tuesday. The receptionist asked what I wanted to work on, and I said relationship problems, which felt like a massive understatement. When Tuesday came, I left work at 4 and drove to Heidi's office across town. She met me in the waiting room, a woman in her 50s with gray hair and kind eyes. Her office had soft lighting and comfortable chairs and a box of tissues on the side table. She asked me to tell her what brought me in, and I started talking about Nathan's tantrums and my retaliation, and everything that had happened over the past months. Saying it all out loud to a stranger made me realize how completely abnormal our situation had become. Heidi asked what I wanted to get out of therapy, and I opened my mouth to say I wanted to fix my marriage, but the words wouldn't come out. I sat there staring at the tissue box and realized I didn't even know if I wanted to save my marriage anymore. Heidi didn't push me for an answer. Instead, she started asking about Nathan's behavior patterns and my responses to them. She explained that what I was describing followed a classic abuse cycle, even though Nathan wasn't hitting me. She said my retaliation was a trauma response to feeling powerless in my own home. Then she said something that hit me hard, that matching his destructiveness didn't give me power back. It just made me participate in my own harm. I left that session feeling like someone had taken everything I thought I knew about my situation and turned it upside down. I kept seeing Heidi twice a week after that first appointment. Over the next few sessions, things started getting clearer in my head. I'd been so focused on proving I wouldn't be pushed around that I'd lost sight of whether this relationship was even worth fighting for. Nathan hadn't changed at all since I started matching his tantrums. He'd just gotten sneakier about his control tactics, like locking the pantry and creating separate internet networks. I was exhausted from constantly being on guard in my own home. Heidi helped me see that I deserved better than living in a war zone, whether I stayed with Nathan or not. 3 weeks into therapy, Nathan's mother called me directly for the first time in weeks. I was sitting in my car outside the clinic after work when her name popped up on my screen. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me.